Good afternoon, everybody. Tim, thank you very much for that introduction. It's a delight to be here and really an honor to even be asked. I want to thank you all for coming and staying to the end. I want to get right to my presentation because it's important for me to hear what you have to say about the economy, what questions you have. My wife tells me I have two problems. One problem is I don't listen to people. And the other problem, I don't remember I can't remember what she said. There was another problem. So you didn't think I'd be funny, did you? You thought this was going to be on the economy. All right, since this is a Hillsdale event, I'm going to discuss the Biden economy much as I would in a college economics classroom. This will be a shorter Reader's Digest version of a few lectures, but I'll attempt to present facts interspersed with some political commentary. Mostly because my wife says I can't help myself, so there's going to be political commentary. Maybe that was the second thing she said. All right, I'm going to cover four topics on the Biden economy. The first is where we are. Second is why does this feel so much worse than we're being told it is? Third, how did we get here? And fourth, is there anything President Biden can do at this point? So first, where are we? Well, I'm going to tell you something that just about everybody on Wall Street knows, despite what you read in the financial press. The Biden administration's economic policies are driving us into a recessionary ditch. Now, this is what happens when a president's economic policies are designed to accomplish leftist political goals, such as advancing a radical climate agenda or increasing government dependence, rather than growing the economy and creating prosperity. Let's see if I can run this thing. Apparently not. There we go. In a recent Wall Street Journal survey of 23 large financial institutions that do business directly with the Federal Reserve, 2/3 predicted a U.S. recession in 2023. Two more predicted a recession in 2024. Only 5 predicted that we would avoid a recession in 2023 and 2024. And even they only predicted we'd have 0.5% in economic growth, in GDP growth, which is, it is way below the 2.1% average over the last 20 years, but is also dangerously close to what traditionally was considered a recession, which was 2 quarters of negative economic growth. That is until the financial press changed that before the midterms so that President Biden would look good after we had 2 quarters of negative economic growth. In any event, for the American people, this all means stagnant, declining standards of living, fewer job opportunities, lower wages, and increased poverty. That's kind of a cool slide. The people that do my slides for me, they think they're very artistic. I told them it was an economic lecture. In any event, and it will mean increased poverty. Overall, a far less vibrant and far less prosperous society, and this is where we are. We're on the verge of a very serious recession. All right, second, why does it feel so much worse than we're being told? Why does it actually feel like we're on the verge of a recession, even though we're being told that we're not? Well, our current economic situation is particularly disheartening as it comes on the heels of the Trump era, which once again opened our eyes to true American potential when we have low taxes, reduced regulation, and a bountiful supply of domestic energy. Now, everybody, particularly minority and low-wage earners, reaped the benefits of the Trump economy. You may recall there were abundant job opportunities, increasing wages, historic highs in family income, historic lows in the poverty rate and the unemployment rate, a growing labor force, it's now shrinking, and declining income inequality, all without inflation. Now let's look at a couple of those metrics just to see how good things were back in the day. Let's look at median family income and poverty. Let's start with median family income. It grew in 2019, which is the last year before the pandemic. It grew to nearly $73,000. That was not only a 6.4% increase over 2018, but it was also the largest yearly increase going back to 1967. It was 45% more growth in 1 year than the Obama-Biden administration achieved in 8 years. Under Trump, median family income grew $4,600 in 1 year. Under Obama and Biden, it grew $3,200 in 8 years. Now, contrary to what you may have heard, the economic benefits of this increased family income were really widespread. This wasn't something where just rich people were getting richer. Every racial group benefited. Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, and white Americans all hit new record high income levels. While median family income increased for whites 5.7%, remember it increased 6.4 on average. So whites were below the average at 5.7. It grew 7.9% for blacks, 7.1% for Hispanic Americans, and 10.6% for Asian Americans. And as for those Democratic talking points about how the Trump tax cuts benefited only the rich, well, they were false. As incomes grew in 2019, the poverty rate plummeted 1.3 percentage point to a new 60-year low of 10.5%. This chart goes back to 1959. And as you can see, just to the left of the 11.6, which is the most recent poverty rate under Biden, you can see that dip down to the 10% line, about 10.5%. That was the low poverty rate, low historical poverty rate, which occurred under President Trump. It's the lowest it's ever been since the government started reporting a poverty rate. This lifted 4.1 million people out of poverty. And just for comparison purposes, under Obama and Biden, the number of people living in poverty increased, not decreased, but increased 787,000 people during the 8 years that they were in office. So 4.1 million people decrease in poverty under Trump, an 800,000 person increase in 8 years with Obama and Biden. So where is the poverty rate today? As you can see, it's at 11.6%. It's bounced back up despite all of the government largesse during the pandemic. And again, the decrease in poverty under Trump disproportionately favored blacks, Hispanics, and Asians, while the poverty rate for whites decreased 0.8%, again below the 1.3 percentage point average. For blacks, it fell 2 percentage points, Hispanics 1.8, and Asians 2.8. Look, 2019 should be remembered as the year of the worker. And that progress didn't come from mandated wage increases, empowered unions, racial reparations, oppressive climate regulation, tax increases, or any other misguided government efforts to redistribute wealth and impose economic equality. Rather, working class Americans of all colors saw their circumstances materially improve in 2019 because of economic freedom, just as occurred in the 1980s under President Reagan. This is probably the only group I could ask this question to, and I might have a few people raise their hands. But were any of you present in 1977 when Ronald Reagan gave his whatever happened to free enterprise speech at Hillsdale College at the von Mises lecture? Nobody? I tell you, if you haven't heard that speech, oh, we have somebody, all right. If you weren't there, you haven't heard it, pull it up on the internet and read it. Much of what I'm going to say today is inspired by what's in that speech, and it was an incredible, incredible economic speech. But today, to get back to reality, our prospects are dimming primarily due to a decline in economic freedom, driving rampant inflation. Since March of 2021, the Consumer Price Index, that's the average change in prices paid by consumers for goods and services, has surged. As we all know, inflation is dramatically increasing, and this is what this chart shows. Now, this chart isn't percentage increases. This is the actual dollars that they base the percentages on. So when Biden's out there saying, inflation's coming down, inflation's coming, well, it's not coming down. It keeps going up. And the reason for that is that it's just increasing at a somewhat slower rate. The Fed looks for inflation to be about 2%. We're now at 6.4%. And of course, under Biden, at one point it hit 9%. So it is better than it was the worst month under Biden. But it's still not coming down. And you can see when you break out on the right-hand side, we broke out what's happened with the Consumer Price Index or inflation under Biden. And it's a horrific story. The chart on the left goes back to 1947. Now, you can see what's happened. This is a phenomenal and important increase. Now, the Fed has to take some credit for this going up. They didn't react in a timely manner when inflation started to set in. Remember, they called it transitory. I look transitory to you. Anyway, they called it transitory, but since last year, they have been taking action, increasing interest rates at really the fastest pace since the 1980s. Now, looking at this, you might think that bump is the 1980s. But this chart only goes back to 2013. That bump is the Trump administration. When there was virtually no inflation, it was about 2%. It was right at the Fed's average. But with a Republican in office, they decided that they needed to raise interest rates and fight all this incredible economic growth we were experiencing. You can see that before Trump took office, there was no increase in interest rates. Those were the Biden years. And then it went down to really zero during the pandemic, and then stayed at zero until they couldn't ignore inflation anymore. And the red line is the increase since last year under President Biden. Now, according to the minutes of the Fed's December meeting, so just a couple months ago, it intends to continue raising rates because inflation's proven, quote, more persistent and widespread than previously anticipated. I guess what's when they were anticipating would be transitory. That's according to Jerome Powell. Now, no matter what you're hearing in the press, the recession that Wall Street financial institutions are forecasting, the one they told the Wall Street Journal they thought was coming, is inevitable if the Fed has to continue increasing interest rates. And in fact, this morning, the Fed came out and said they're going to continue increasing interest rates because they need to get this inflation under control. So how did this happen? Like, after the great Trump economy years, all we needed to do to create dynamic economic growth was get back to the policies we had in place and watch the economy boom. Now, I wrote 2 pamphlets during the pandemic. They call them broadsides. They're from Encounter Books. And they said exactly that. One was entitled Getting America Back to Work. That was in, I think, June or July of 2020. And the second one a few months later was It's Time to Let America Get Back to Work, because I was getting frustrated. But that obviously didn't happen. America didn't get back to work. We didn't have those kinds of economic policies. And why is that? Well, coming out of the pandemic, we really knew 2 things. First, we knew people had a lot of money, which would drive the demand for goods. The demand for goods would go way up. Personal savings from 1959 through 1920 or through 2021 are on this chart, and you can see going back to 1959, the savings rate for Americans was pretty level. And then during the pandemic, obviously it surged. It was unprecedented. By the way, keep in mind the left-hand side of this chart, because I'm going to show you a more updated chart shortly, and I want you to keep in mind just how consistent the savings rate was going back to 1959. But this chart shows you've got this huge surge. Now, the surge wasn't a mystery. The federal government handed out $5 trillion during the pandemic, and people really had very few places to spend all this money. They couldn't go out. Nobody wanted to travel. Nobody wanted to go to restaurants. Nobody wanted to go shopping. Everybody was kind of staying home because they didn't want to get the virus. So by early 2021, and that's where this chart ends, early 2021, you can see the savings rate is significantly higher than it has ever been. So you knew people had a bunch of money, demand was going to be high, people had cash. What else did we know? Well, second, we knew fewer people were working. Back. There we go. We knew fewer people were working. And really, if you tried to do anything around your house back then, you knew that, right? First of all, you couldn't get anybody to come do anything. And then if they wanted to come do something and they had to buy a new sink or something to put in for you, that nobody was making sinks. You couldn't get anything. People were unable to work. Businesses were unable to anticipate future demand. And so there were a lot fewer people employed, a lot fewer people working. So obviously, when Biden took office, you knew 2 things. People had a lot of money, which was going to drive demand. And the supply of goods was going to be low because really you can't make goods, you can't deliver goods if you don't have people working. So you knew demand would be high and supply would be low. Now, as we all know, inflation is a result of demand exceeding supply. Even if think the Trump years when demand was high and supply was high, we didn't have inflation because there were enough goods to meet the demand, so prices didn't surge up. But when demand exceeds supply, as it obviously was going to, you knew you were going to have an inflationary surge. Well, what would you do if you were coming in as president? You knew not enough people were working, so you had supply problems. You knew people had a lot of money, so you're going to have increased demand. What would you do? Well, I'll tell you what you wouldn't do. You wouldn't give people more money, juicing demand. through welfare programs that discourage work, thereby further reducing supply. That seems simple enough, but Democrats didn't get it. See, Democrats thought, and Biden and his economic team in particular, they really could have just sat back and with Trump's 2019 policies in place, watched the market correct itself, and that they could have taken credit for the rebound.